as we continue with our rolling coverage, we are now joined by political analyst Justice Malala and former Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza. Thank you both so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to start with you, Justice. It's been a very long time, so it's good to have you in studio.
It's good to be here.
Great. Let's just start off with who Mangosuthu Buthelezi was. A very complex legacy, a very complex man, two sides, the traditional prince, the traditional prime minister, but also a big political leader.
A massive political leader. I think there's so many aspects to Mangosuthu Buthelezi. There's the young man that fought her with other liberation movement leaders, like, whether it's Robert Mugabe or Oliver Tambo and so forth. There's the leader who took up on the Bantustan, if you will, the homeland system, as the leader of KwaZulu-Natal. There's the traditional man. And then there's the very controversial, in fact, some of us would say, not just controversial, but a deadly and bloody human being of the 1980s and 1990s who led the IFP, which laid siege to KwaZulu-Natal and parts of Gauteng, in which thousands of people were killed in violence that he, in my view and many other people's view, he did nothing to stop and did nothing to help drag back. And then there's the post-apartheid after 1994. But I came of age at a time when Mangosuthu Buthelezi was someone to be feared, someone who would come into studio like this and have his snobkiri and actually once beat a presenter on air. And so this is someone who is not just a political leader that we can celebrate with, oh, he was a great leader of the people. He was controversial, and he had some nasty, nasty aspects to him, including tolerating and perhaps even stoking the fires of the early 90s of massive violence in Gauteng, the Sebokeng massacre, the Wipato massacre, and many others that the ANC laid at his door.
Certainly, and I want us to get a little bit deeper into that, but maybe we can also bring in Advocate Ntsebeza, especially because you being part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I want to speak about how 16 members of the IFP applied for amnesty before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission held at Sebokeng, and we're obviously speaking about this massacre that unfolded in 1992. And to their own admission, they carried out attacks as members of the IFP. That is something that Mangosuthu Buthelezi could not escape back then and even today when people speak about who he was and the role he played. Justice, you've just said now, he didn't stop that. He didn't really come out and say, I was part of it or I wasn't part of it. Advocate Ntsebeza, what, from your recollection of the TRC with these 16 IFP members saying, in actual fact, we were ordered by the IFP to order out those hits on those thousands of people?
Yes, I remember that very distinctly because, as you know, I was the commissioner in charge of the interpretive unit, and there was an Operation Marion, which was the training of IFP members in the Caprivi district in what was then Southeast Africa, Namibia. And ostensibly, these people were being trained there in order for them to come back and provide Mangosuthu Buthelezi with some sort of parliamentary bodyguard kind of capability. But the truth, which is what then came in the amnesty applications, is that those people were trained there, and whilst they were being trained, when they came to apply for amnesty, and in your application for amnesty, as you know, you had to make a full disclosure. They said, as they were being trained in the Caprivi Street, they were being told, your mission from here is to go and annihilate all UDF members in the areas where you come from. So when they came back, there was this massacre at what was called, it came to be known as the KwaMakuta massacre. And the irony of it, of course, it was a tragedy of errors. They went to the wrong place and they killed the wrong people. But people are people, and they were, it was a terrible bloodbath. Mm-hmm. But it was effected by people who went and killed these people because in the Kapili district, when they were being trained by the South African Defence Force at an operation that had been sanctioned by Justice Malala, as you know, was the Minister of Defence. So there was this collusion between South African Defence Force, right from the ministry, and members of the IFP who were trained in the Kapili district, ostensibly to provide security detail for, Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi. But truthfully, they themselves testified to come and kill anyone who was associated with the UDF. And that was a tragedy.
A big tragedy, because I'm actually seeing on social media, Justice, and we've actually received some, messages from people saying that they've lost family members, they're still feeling that impact of the massacre. And Mangosuthu Buthelezi was also labeled as an apartheid collaborator, something that he denied and took great exception to, saying, I was never an apartheid collaborator. In fact, I was central to freeing this country and to getting rid of the apartheid regime.
That is patently untrue on the part of Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Take how military intelligence, and this has been proven, and Advocate Ntsebeza did it at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, how the apartheid military intelligence paid money for him to form, people like Mbazi Mashilowa would know this, UWUSA, which was the United Workers' Union of South Africa at the time, to destabilize KwaZulu. How the SPUs, self-protection units of the IFP, were trained by military intelligence operatives. Throughout its history, the IFP either benefited or received directly monies and training to cause havoc in South Africa and to delay. Remember, Mangosuthu Buthelezi did not agree to participate in the 1994 election until just 10 days or so before the elections took place. When he finally agreed, I want to remind your viewers here about the 24th of April 1994, when the ANC decided that, well, Mangosuthu says we can canvass in all over South Africa. 10 ANC members went to Ulundi, the capital of the then KwaZulu, to canvass. They were attacked. They ran away. They ran into the police station. Mangosuthu Buthelezi was in that police station. In that police station, to this day, he has not received justice. But a man called Mr. Mkunu was shot in the head in that police station. Mr. Mangosuthu Buthelezi was in that police station, and he never said to the family and to other people who died on that day, several others were killed in the day, he never said once, gave them the truth or said sorry for his participation in these things. And so today politicians might stand on podiums and say, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, a great statesman and so forth. Perhaps at other parts of his life he was that. But in this period of history, between 1975 with the formation of the IFP and 1994 with the end of apartheid and the April 27, Mr. Mangosuthu Buthelezi, I would say, has blood on his hands.
Advocate Ntsebeza, what would you say? Do you agree with Justice Malala when it comes to blood on his hands, especially having been a commissioner in the TRC and hearing about the atrocities of this massacre that really puts the IFP central to what happened, especially here in Gauteng?
Yeah, well, one doesn't want to speak ill of the dead. But I can tell you now that I agree with Justice 100%. There is no way in which one can say he did not have any case to answer. And the whole question of blood on his hands is manifest from some of the things that I've indicated. In fact, one of them being the dramatic, the killing at Kwamakuta that I've talked about. The Boipatong massacre, I mean, there it is very clear that, the people who carried on that, killing in that area did so ostensibly and quite evidentially, in support of, or, in so far as they thought they were carrying the desires of the organization, which, Mangosuthu Buthelezi was head of. And I'm not aware that after all of those massacres and the killings, in which, of course, the South African National Defense, South African Defense Force, or their security details, no, not security details, the security, structures of the South African, security services were part of. All of those formations took part in the slayings in Boipatong, and there was no accountability for it. And therefore it is very difficult to say anything about those massacres without associating them with the personality of the late Mangosuthu Buthelezi.
So, Justice, I want to ask you about what those massacres did to these townships and these hostels. And I ask you in the context of, we've been seeing a lot of reaction from hostel leaders, for example, or hostel dwellers that were either in support of the IFP or said, what happened with these massacres, because it wasn't an isolated incident, it was in a number of townships and hostels within Gauteng. How that completely changed the landscape, completely changed the political standing, especially back then.
Yeah. So apartheid was a horrible thing. Apartheid needed black men to work if you go to the Eastern Togoza and so forth, to work in steel factories. And so they'd come from Limpopo and all over and so forth and live alongside communities in these hostels. So you take Togoza, for example, where I used to report as a young person. You had the Kumalo Street, and you had just residents living on the other side of the street and the township, and you had these hostels. Over time, the IFP took over these hostels, got rid of, essentially, it was almost an ethnic cleansing where either you were an IFP supporter or you were from KwaZulu-Natal, and they took over these hostels, started having skirmishes with the township residents. Essentially, those townships died because people started fleeing the presence of the IFP in these townships. So you have many today. You may say, oh, there are people saying in this or that township. If you go to Sebokeng, you go to Togoza, you go to many other townships across Gauteng and so forth, those have become there are dead zones in those. People had to flee their homes. People died because of attacks. The Wipato massacre, the Sebokeng massacre, all the witnesses say they emanated from those hostels, organized by hostel dwellers who were given weapons by members of military intelligence who then attacked communities. It was a horrible time. I want to remind your viewers, 1,000 people on average died every year from political violence between 1990, 91, 92, 93 up to 1994. And those people died essentially from violence emanating from hostels, from the surge of the IFP in Gauteng in many parts, and part of KwaZulu-Natal. And I'm not saying other people are not responsible. The ANC in KwaZulu-Natal had a lot of blood on its hands and so forth. But in remembering Mangosuthu Buthelezi, we have to remember him as the person who supported Nelson Mandela after 1994 in the government of national unity, acted as president and so forth. Fantastic. But we also have to remember the man who between in the 1980s and the early 1990s said nothing, did nothing to stop the bloodbath that went on in this country.
And I think it's such an important view of his complex legacy, because also, and maybe Advocate Ntsebeza, you can speak on this, he was also very true to his tradition and culture, being the Prime Minister, being a prince, making sure that traditional leaders have a role even in government structures and moving into democratic South Africa. He was very vocal about that. Even till his very last days. I mean, he tried his very best. We do know that there's some conflict now with the royal family, but he was very stern about that. Let's move away from the political Mangosuthu Buthelezi, you know, the traditional and cultural Mangosuthu Buthelezi that many would also see.
You know, I've always had a problem with this whole thing about a Zulu nation. Not that I am not appreciative of people having to follow their customs and what have you. I mean, the project, the democratic project, as I understand it, since the formation of the earliest political organization in South Africa, the ANC in 1912, was to build a South African nation, which is made up of all the people who live in this country, black and white. The tribalism that, you know, associated certain people, you know, with, or which clothed, you know, certain people with, and, you know, with nationhood instead of being effective of a nation is always troublesome. I have always wanted to see the emergence of a South African nation. I'm a Xhosa-speaking South African, and I would not hope to see a day arising when people in that part of the world where I was born and bred in the Eastern Cape start thinking of forming a Xhosa nation, you know, in South Africa, where, because that feeds into the whole apartheid ideology. You will recall that there was a time when in this country, the Nationalist Party was talking of a constellation of Southern African states, where the concept was that there would be a Xhosa nation, a Tswana nation, an African, and a white nation, of which, of course, the Afrikaners would be the majority, a Zulu nation, and all of those, the Tswana nation and all that, which would have then completely destroyed the whole project, democratic project, which was to form a single nation, you know, different, but, you know, united and not divided into various tribal or ethnical appellations, which we now elevate to nationhood. If you ask me, I am for a South African nationhood in which everyone has got a claim. That does not mean I deny people from the Eastern Cape from seeking to be, you know, Xhosas, you know, but not as a nation, but as a segment of the South African nation, which, you know, observes such customs that Xhosa people, you know, observe, without elevating Xhosas to a nation. That is why now there's always this problem about certain so-called kings complaining, as I understand it, that the Zulu king seems to be elevated above them in the other areas of South Africa. South Africa is a vast country, and there are people who claim kinghood or queenhood, like, for instance, in Limpopo.
Yeah.
So I think the sooner we dissociate ourselves from this whole thing about a Zulu nation, which really is a tribe of many tribes in South Africa, the better it is going to be for the democratic project. So those are my views.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, we all have views. We're all entitled to them. Justice, just a last question to you. I don't know if you want to answer to what Advocate said.
No, I absolutely agree with Advocate Ntsebeza. And it is so fantastic to hear today in 2023 these values, the idea of non-racialism, non-sexism, non-tribalism, being elevated about narrow nationalisms that keep on coming up in our... So, I mean, I almost have tears in my eyes listening to Advocate Ntsebeza. This is what South Africa is about. And the idea that certain nations can be, oh, we are special this and we are special this, which was the type of Zulu nationalism that was advocated, particularly in the late 80s and early 90s by the IFP. I'm so glad to hear these values, that there are so many like Advocate Ntsebeza who hold them dear and who are influential enough and brave enough to enunciate them again and again.
Just lastly, if you can maybe just tell us what you think moving forward. The IFP president was saying today they have to find new ways of moving forward without their founder, Mangosuthu Buthelezi. What do you think that's going to look like?
Oh, it's a bit of a conundrum. I think the IFP being, for example, in the Moonshot Pact or the whatever it's called today, it shows you the IFP was a central player in South African politics. It got in 1994 nearly 10%, I think, but in the high single digits, it's now playing at about 3%. It might be able, together with the DA perhaps, be able to form a coalition in KwaZulu-Natal, and there might be some movement there. But I think as a national player, you know, whether it's Velenkosi Tlhabisa or Velenkosini Tlhabisa and other leaders, they haven't emerged as national players really. They've remained a regional, provincial entity with some support in places like Gauteng, where we are. But I think that without the centrality of Mangosuthu Buthelezi, after nearly 60 years, the IFP may be slowly leaving the political stage. It might survive for a while longer, but Mangosuthu Buthelezi did the IFP a disservice, whether it was when Gianni and other leaders came through and they were sorted aside. You remember the NFP came from the IFP. He stayed too long. He stayed in power too long. And the IFP is struggling to emerge with other newer leaders who will rejuvenate it.
And many would say with younger leaders because of his hold onto power for so long. Advocate Ntsebeza, maybe we can just end off with you. I know you said earlier on we should never speak ill of the dead, but what do you think people are taking from his legacy, from who Mangosuthu Buthelezi was, the role he played politically, but also the role he played traditionally and culturally? What do you think people, especially young leaders, looking at this and, you know, what Justice just said, what's going to happen politically for the party moving forward?
Well, it really will depend on which people are being spoken to at the time. And as I say, I mean, for instance, what about the families of those who were massacred in Boipatong? What about the families of those who were made by mistake in the KwaMakuta, massacre? And a number of, I mean, for instance, the number of people who got killed, in the townships, Katlehong, everywhere else, all in the name of, upholding an ideology of a particular party, the so-called black-on-black violence. What about the fact that, there is evidence that we're pursuing that there was a collusion between the South African, security structures and some people who were in the IFP. And even if one cannot say, Mangosuthu Buthelezi himself was sanctioning this, or knew of the plot to actually for these forces to collaborate in the attacks in the townships, But the fact of the matter is that it became known, it was a notorious fact that it was members of the IFP who were, fighting side by side with the elements of the army, and they were jointly attacking houses in Boipatong. And that is now notorious history. So those are some of the things that one doesn't want to say, look, yeah, he was this, that, one must respect the fact that he's now no more, and there are relatives of his who are mourning his death, which is why I said, it's difficult to speak of the dead. But then which dead are we speaking of? Are we speaking of the dead of the victims? Because they were victims who claim to this day that they were the receiving end of the violence that was meted out by his formations. And you can't then divorce the feelings of those victims, at this moment from some of the things with which he was associated. And for which, as Justice said, he never seemed to have apologized or he never denied, he never said they were not involved, notwithstanding the accusations, especially when those amnesty applicants came before us to say, when we were being trained at the previous trip, it was for purposes of annihilating UDF as we know it.
Okay,
That's
thank
a
you.
tall order.
Yes, thank you so much both for your time this evening. That was political analyst Justice Malala and former TRC Commissioner Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza. Thank you both so much for speaking to us this evening.